And hopefully you should all be able to see me sharing my screen in just a second. So once again, welcome to the webinar and thank you for joining us from all over the place, all over the UK and some people from other places in the world as well. It's fantastic to see so many people joining us tonight. So as I said, I'm Kat, the Community Engagement Officer, and we've got Becky, the Squirrel Project Manager here. So the webinar tonight is hopefully the first in a series of many that we're hoping to do. And it's all about our Reds Return Squirrel Reintroduction project. And I'd like to thank our funders just at the start here because we really couldn't do this work without them. So the European Outdoor Conservation Association and the People's Trust for Endangered Species are two of our main funders. And then we've got lots of other generous individuals as well who support the project and lots of volunteers as well who are vital to the work. So huge thanks to them. So to introduce Trees for Life, for those of you who might not know too much about us, we're a conservation charity in the Scottish Highlands and we're dedicated to rewilding the Scottish Highlands. So we've established 44 tree planting sites and in the last 30 years or so have planted nearly 2 million trees. I say we, but really we've done that with the help of a lot of volunteers. So our vision is of a revitalised wild forest in the Scottish Highlands that provides space for wildlife to flourish and for communities to thrive. And our mission is to rewild the Highlands by enabling the restoration of the globally unique Caledonian forest, which once covered much of Scotland. And integral to our success is the involvement of people. People are part of the landscape. So the Reds Return project is one of many. It's been going since about 2016. And the work was based on some pioneering work that was done by the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation in other parts of the Highlands. And its aim is to create new populations of red squirrels across the North West Highlands that are free from grey squirrels. So that's very important, and I will explain a little bit more about why in a few slides. The first phase of it was 3 years over in Wester Ross. So hopefully you can see my mouse, but the group of red dots and labels over on the west coast, Inveru, Letteru, Shieldig, all of that sort of group there. And phase 2 was introductions to the North Highlands, so around Spinningdale, and down to the south at Loch Allen as well, the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. And our third one that's actually taking place at the moment is a little bit north of Spinningdale, a place called Golspie. So as well as the actual reintroductions, we also are hoping to survey the Highlands to produce a distribution map of red squirrels and to survey for further potential release sites to suitable habitats. And we also hope to engage schools and communities near the release sites in the work that we're doing and why it's important. So some of these might look familiar and some might not. This is just to make the point that there are squirrels in most parts of the world. So all over the Americas, Eurasia and Africa, there are lots of different types of squirrel, from ground squirrels, pygmy squirrels, marmots, to the ones that are more familiar in the UK. So red squirrels and grey squirrels down the bottom right in the middle there. And the word squirrel comes from a Greek word, skiuros, meaning shadow-tailed, obviously referring to the lovely bushy tail they have that follows them everywhere. So red squirrels are our only native squirrel in the UK. So a native animal or plant is something that is indigenous to a country. So it basically made its own way there. In the case of the squirrel, it would have made its own way to the UK after the end of the last ice age, once the forest had recolonized. So it hasn't been introduced by humans. Their habitat is mixed woodland. You often find them associated with coniferous woodland, like pines, but mixed woodland is the best for them because it gives them a broad range of foods to eat. And that's important because they're an omnivore, so they're not vegetarian. They will eat plant matter, animal matter, they'll eat fungi, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. And they're opportunistic feeders in that they will eat whatever is available at a particular time of year. So they eat different kind of foods throughout the year. They're quite a small mammal, around 40 centimetres long, including the tail, quite a lot smaller than the average grey squirrel. And they have this beautiful russet red coat, although it can be variable. So you can sometimes see squirrels with particularly the tails bleached to an almost blonde colour. In some parts of their range, which extend across Europe, they can be dark brown or black. So they can vary. but generally in the UK, we get this lovely red colour. So that shadowtail that I mentioned, that's really important to them for being able to balance when they're running up and down the trees and leaping from branch to branch. They also use it for warmth. They can wrap it around themselves in the cold months, and they use it for communication as well. In terms of young, they can have up to around 6 kits or kittens per year. So in a good year where there's a lot of food, they can have 2 litters of up to 3 kits, so potentially 6 in a year. And they live for around 2 to 7 years in the wild. But unfortunately, they are a species under threat. So there used to be around 3.5 million red squirrels in the UK, we believe, and today there are around 171,000. 75% of those are in Scotland. So it's a real stronghold for them, and that's why there's a lot of work going on in Scotland to conserve this species, keystone species of the forest. So why are they under threat? Well, there's a few reasons. One of them being a long history of deforestation across the UK, not just in Scotland, though that's what this map refers to. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the original extent of the native pine woods of Scotland, the Caledonian pine wood, which, despite its name, was not just pine. It would have been a mixture of all sorts of different native species. But after the last ice age, once the forest had reached its maximum, it was covering approximately this shaded area here on the left. And today, we only have 80 or 90 remnants of this Caledonian pine wood left. Now, of course, there has been some forest regeneration. There's also plantations. So this map on the right is not all of the forest in Scotland, but it's all of the sort of ancient, unbroken, continuous cover of Caledonian pine wood, which is the red squirrel's native habitat. And as well as deforestation, habitat fragmentation is a really big problem. So if you're a red squirrel living in one of these little black dots on the right-hand side, and maybe it's a bad year for food, there's not a lot of pine cones around, say, it's going to be very difficult to get to another patch of woodland where you can find more food, because red squirrels don't like traveling across open ground. It exposes them to predators. They won't find shelter and food so easily across open ground. So they become isolated in these populations, which can lead to all sorts of other problems. Another issue back up until around the 1940s was persecution. So organisations like the Highland Red Squirrel Club, their mission, their aim was to eradicate red squirrels as they were seen to be damaging forestry plantations. So red squirrels had almost become extinct in the Highlands during the 1800s because of forest loss, and then some estates reintroduced them from England and Sweden, similar to the way that Victorians introduced grey squirrels, sort of as fashion accessories that they wanted to have on their estate. And then they spread from where they were introduced, and they will sometimes eat bark from trees to eat the living wood underneath. And if they do that all the way around a tree trunk, it's called ring barking, and it basically kills the tree. So whether they were doing this at enough scale to actually pose a threat to the forestry industry, I'm not sure, but it was certainly believed that they were. And so estates were paid a bounty and asked to send in the tails of all the squirrels that they had killed to try and eradicate them. And there were over 100,000 records submitted. So you can imagine there were probably more squirrels than that actually killed. So that did a lot of damage to the Highland population of red squirrels. And then another big issue has been the arrival of the grey squirrel. So I said that red squirrels are our only native squirrel. Grey squirrels have been introduced by humans. They're actually native to North America. And they were introduced to the UK at several different locations between the mid-1870s and around 1929. And the issue with that is they can't coexist with red squirrels. So they outcompete them in broadleaf and mixed woodland, partly because they're used to eating a diet much richer in things like acorns, which are high in a chemical that's hard to digest. But the grey squirrels have evolved with these forests. They're used to eating these things that are harder to digest, which means they can eat some of the seeds and nuts that grow in this country earlier in the season than red squirrels can, and they basically get to this food source first. They also will pilfer food caches. So red and grey squirrels don't hibernate, they store food. It's called caching throughout the autumn so they can eat it in the winter. And I imagine red squirrels probably pilfer other red squirrels' caches as well, but perhaps grey squirrels, being a little bit bigger, will eat more, and they will just be another potential thief of food stores. And then one of the biggest issues with the grey squirrels is that they carry a disease that we call squirrel pox. Now, the grey squirrels are immune to this disease, but they are carriers. And unfortunately, the red squirrels are not immune, and this disease is deadly for them. So whenever grey spread into a new part of the UK, red squirrels have been disappearing within about 15 years of their arrival. And remember, I said there are around 170,000 red squirrels, we believe, in the UK. There are about 2.7 million grey squirrels. So this shows you the distribution and the spread of the grey squirrels since around 1945 on the left-hand side there. So just a few kind of localized locations in England and a few in Ireland there. And then by 2000, they've spread across most of England. They've made their way into parts of Scotland and made their way across quite a large part of Ireland and Northern Ireland as well. And then by 2010, they'd made even greater inroads to other parts of the UK. And you can see there's still a few strongholds. So down at the Isle of Wight and Brownsea Island, Anglesey, some places around just south of the Scottish border as well. But all of these places that are orange on these maps are places where there are both red and grey squirrels, and that's not sustainable. As I said, they can't coexist. So any of these grey patches, unless something is done to bring the grey numbers down or to stop their spread, then those orange patches will also turn grey. You can also see there aren't many red squirrels in the North West Highlands. There's a big patch of green, which means no squirrels. Part of that was to do with the forest loss and also the persecution that I mentioned. But by 2010, you can see a couple of little populations. And if you look at distribution now, there are actually more sightings appearing in the North West Highlands, partly to do with reintroductions, so Trees for Life's reintroductions, and also the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation. So to talk about the actual translocations and how we do it. So when Becky's looking for receptor sites, such as this one at Spinningdale, Leadmore and Migdale Woodlands, which is owned by the Woodland Trust Scotland, she's looking for places that red squirrels aren't going to be able to get to naturally. So that's because they don't like to travel across open ground, and these woodlands often are quite a distance apart. There must be no threat of grey squirrels, and luckily we don't have any grey squirrels in the Highlands. They should be a minimum of 200 hectares, and they should be a mixture of suitable tree species, lots of different species and ages as well, because certain trees will produce more kind of towards the middle of their life rather than when they're very young or very old. We always make sure there's landowner support and appropriate long-term management plans, so we know that that woodland is not going to be clear felled, for instance. For donor sites, we get a license from Nature Scott for 5 years to give us permission to actually capture squirrels. They're all wild, none of them are captive bred, and they come from both woodland and from domestic gardens, although at the moment they're not coming from domestic gardens, obviously due to coronavirus. And just to make sure that we're not having a negative impact on the local population, we don't take more than 2 per 200 hectares. A variety of sites also helps to increase genetic diversity as well. And we'll take up to 30 squirrels per translocation to make sure there's a healthy population, a healthy kind of seed population that will then grow in their new habitat. So the procedure itself, so humane traps are set up on the trees with a little pot of some sort of food source, and there will be feeding, pre-baiting happening near these traps for a few days beforehand, so the squirrels will get used to coming to the trap for food. And then on the morning they get set, and volunteers will go around and check the traps really regularly to make sure the squirrels don't spend too long in them. And then over in the top right there, you can see a squirrel getting a health inspection just before it's going to be put into one of its big nest boxes to be transported. So the health inspection is to make sure that they don't have squirrel pox for one, but also to make sure that they don't have any sort of injury. So if they do have an injury, then we take them back to the place that they've been caught from and set them free. And then we do what's called a hard release, which means there's no acclimatization period. They get put into one of these nest boxes you can see in the bottom right, attached to a tree with a feeder nearby. You can see one of the feeders in the bottom left there. And the squirrels will stay in there overnight. So Becky, or one of the volunteers, will put some moss or hay or something in the hole just overnight. And in the morning, the squirrel will push it out and go and explore its new habitat. And then we do supplementary feeding for a few weeks after the initial release, just to make sure that while they're getting used to their new habitat and finding enough food, they've got something there just in case. And then post-release monitoring is a really important part of the translocations as well, to make sure that we can keep track of whether the squirrels are still in the release area, whether they're spreading, whether they are feeding in those areas, whether they're breeding as well. So Becky will do these presence absence surveys, and we also rely on local people reporting sightings as well. So things that Becky is looking out for are actual sightings themselves, but sometimes easier to spot are things like drays, which are squirrel nests, and feeding sign as well. And so far, so good. The project has been a success, and we're seeing squirrels spreading at all of their release sites, and we're seeing them breeding as well, and we're seeing them colonize new patches of woodland nearby, sometimes even traveling further than we expected them to across open ground, as they did in Shieldig, for instance. They were released at the Ben Shieldig estate, which is also owned by the Woodland Trust Scotland. And within a couple of weeks, I think it was, they'd made it around the coast to Inveralligin, which is about 16 kilometres away. So that was really surprising. And now there's a good established population of squirrels over there. So hopefully at sites 1 and 2 on the map on the right-hand side there, we'll start seeing some more sightings as well after recent translocations. These maps, by the way, have come from a project called Scottish Squirrels. It's run by Scottish Wildlife Trust, and they have an online map where absolutely anybody can report sightings of red and grey squirrels across Scotland. And it's really useful for them, and it's also useful for us to keep track of where the squirrels are, how the greys are spreading, and for us particularly, how well our translocated squirrels are doing. And there's also been really positive engagement with local communities. So a lot of people have volunteered to help out with the translocations themselves or with the subsequent feeding. And there have also been school visits, guided walks, and people training to monitor for us. So training to recognise feeding sign and drays and report that back to us. Now, a lot of that was put on hold this year due to coronavirus, but hopefully we can get back to doing a lot more of that in 2021. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how to identify squirrel sign. And the reason for that is everybody wants to see a red squirrel, right? They can be quite elusive and hard to spot. But if you can see drays or feeding sign around, then you know that there are squirrels nearby. So this is a great thing to look out for. So to talk about drays, first of all. So as I said, these are squirrel nests. And they're a dense hollow ball of interwoven twigs around the size of a football. They often look quite messy, like this one in the photo. Sometimes a little bit bigger than a football as well. And quite different from most birds' nests in that they are this ball shape rather than just sort of a flat bowl shape. Now for stability, they're normally tight up against a tree trunk in some forked branches. Although when they are breeding, when they've got young, they will often build a dray further away from the tree trunk on smaller branches to deter pine martens, which are the only predator that can actually follow them through the trees. But remember, a red squirrel is only around 40 centimetres long with its tail, and a pine marten is around the size of a domestic cat. So if a squirrel has built its dray on some quite fine branches, it's going to be light enough to get to its dray, but if a pine marten tried to follow, it's going to be too heavy for those branches. So it's really smart to try and avoid them. They'll be quite far off the ground, minimum 6 meters up, or maybe around 2/3 of the way up a tree. So sometimes can be quite hard to spot, but that just keeps them safe from any predators nearer the ground. And to keep them warm, they line the inside with grass, leaves, moss, and fur. And one squirrel doesn't just use one dray, they could use around 7 drays each, and they can build them quite quickly. Sometimes they'll even sleep in other squirrels' drays. Sometimes they'll share them. They don't seem to be too territorial about them. And another way that you can tell squirrel drays from birds' nests is birds will often pick up fallen twigs, so they'll already have lost their leaves, whereas squirrels will actually gnaw or tear branches off trees that often still have the leaves attached. So if you can see a nest that looks like it's got a lot of leaves in it, and it is this ball shape, then it's more likely to be a squirrel dray. This one that you can see on the right here, though, this has actually been made out of larch branches, and larch is a deciduous conifer, so it loses its needles, which is why you can't see any leaves in this one. So here are some examples just to show you that it can be quite tricky to find drays, but it's a lot easier when you're looking in deciduous trees in the winter when they've lost all of their leaves. You can really see the shape of the drays as in this left-hand side picture against the sky. And then the one on the right is basically just above the middle of the picture. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but you can see the sort of bulge shape in the tree there. That's in Scots pine, I think. There we go. And then a couple more examples. Again, the one on the right in a deciduous tree in winter is quite easy to see. And I wonder if that might be a breeding one. It's built quite far away from the trunk. So if you're looking at something in a tree that you think might be a squirrel dray, but you're not too sure because you can't quite see the shape of it, if possible, try and get uphill from it so that you're looking side on or looking from above, and that will give you a better idea of the shape of it. And obviously binoculars might help as well to get a closer look. And look out for these things, which are called witches' brooms. So these can look like drays sometimes, but it's actually, well, it's called a deformity, although it doesn't really do the trees any damage in most cases. It's where there's been a fungal or viral infection in a part of the tree that causes an overgrowth of this twiggy stuff, usually without leaves. I think the leaves in this picture have just been kind of blown into and caught by the twigs. So they can look like drays, but they're very, very dense. So they're not going to be hollow. You won't see a way in and out. And often you find them in places where you wouldn't see a dray. So this one, for instance, was less than 2 meters off the ground. So the squirrels wouldn't build their drays that close to the ground. And sometimes you see them dangling from quite small branches as well, rather than supported by branches. So to go through some feeding sign then, first of all, we need to know what squirrels are eating at different times of the year. So I said that they are opportunistic. They will eat lots and lots of different things depending on what's available. So cones are available all year round. So a native cone would be Scots pine. So they're actually eating the seeds from inside the cone rather than the cone itself. But there are lots of plantations in Scotland and other parts of the UK as well. Normally trees like Douglas fir, Sitka and Norway spruce and larch, which also have seeds underneath the scales in the cone. And they are a brilliant food source for squirrels. They're available all the time. But they will make use of other things to get all of the nutrients that they need throughout the year. So in spring, you'll get lots of flowers and tree buds and shoots coming out, which squirrels will make use of. Into the summer, when there are more insects around, they will happily eat them and any flowers that are coming out later on, like oak flowers as well. And then in the autumn, there is an abundance of different types of food. There are berries all over the place. So we've got blaeberries or bilberries down at the bottom, sloes, blackberries, rose hips, and then lots of seeds or tree nuts as well, native and non-native. So non-natives like the sweet chestnut or horse chestnut, and then native ones like ash, field maple, oak. Beech is native to parts of the UK. There's a question of whether or not it's native to Scotland, but it is a brilliant food source for squirrels anyway. And into the winter, they will be, again, eating seeds from cones, but they will also go for tree bark and fungi, and then their caches, their stores that they normally hide under the ground, dig little holes for them, but sometimes can also hide in holes in trees and things like that. So you might see squirrels, you might have seen them this autumn digging away and storing things under the ground. And this time of year, you might see them digging things back up again. Now, this is a really, really important behaviour for our woodlands. This is what makes them one of the keystone species of the forests in the UK, because they generally are not going to dig up all of the nuts that they've hidden. And so anything that they have buried under the ground that's not too damaged is quite likely to germinate and grow into another tree. So squirrels are engineers of the forest. They plant trees. Whether they're doing it deliberately or not is an open question. But certainly they are helping to spread seeds to new areas. So most trees are not going to grow right underneath the parent tree. Most seeds aren't going to grow very well there, but the squirrels will take them further away than maybe the wind would blow them or something else would take them. So they're helping new woodlands to grow, helping trees to spread. So I'll show you what some of the feeding sign looks like. So hazelnuts, you've probably seen, have this really, really tough woody shell, and then the round nut is inside this shell. So squirrels need to peel off the kind of leafy bracts that are around the shell, and then they need to break the shell open itself. Now, luckily, they've got really strong teeth and strong jaws. So whereas something like a bird might just peck away until it breaks, squirrels will nibble a little notch in the pointed end of the hazelnut and then bite down and break the shell clean in half. And you end up with things that look a bit like this. So the two at the far edges are almost certainly squirrel. The one in the middle, I think actually might be a bank foal or something, because you can see it's got teeth marks all around it. Whereas with squirrels, you would just see teeth marks at the top. So the half shell on the far left there, you can see a lot of the teeth marks from where it's made the notch at the top before it bit through the hazelnut. And squirrels aren't too shy about where they're eating. Something like a mouse would be dragging its food back near its hole or underneath some shelter so that it's protected from predators, whereas a squirrel will happily sit on a tree stump or on a branch and break these things open and just drop the pieces on the ground. So you'll often find the split hazel shells underneath a hazel tree if there are squirrels feeding on them. So with beech and oak, they're a little bit easier to get into than the hazel shells, but they still need to peel some bits off that they can't actually eat. So with beech, they need to break open the sort of slightly hairy, spiky shell, and it breaks naturally into 4 pieces. And with oak, they need to get rid of the cup, and they need to peel off the green, or a little bit later in the season, the brown, tougher casing on the shell. So you end up with the discarded bits left. So with beech, kind of in the middle there at the top, on the top left-hand side, you can see a beech shell that has opened naturally, and it's got these 4 kind of petals to it. So squirrels will pull them apart, and you'll end up with individual petals or 2 and 2, just broken in half. And then the nuts inside will have been peeled of their quite thin shell. So you'll find discarded bits of that as well. And then with acorns, as I said, they've peeled off the cup, so they've broken it into pieces and then peeled off the shell around the acorn as well. So you find all these bits scattered on the ground, usually underneath the trees that they've come from. Horse chestnut, similar, although generally the fleshy case will break open into 2 or 3 pieces naturally, and then squirrels need to peel off the tougher casing, this lovely kind of chestnut coloured casing around the shell. So as you can see in the picture on the left here, you'll just find ripped bits of the shell underneath the tree. Now this is one of their main food sources and a really iconic tree of Scotland. So pine cones take 2 years to become ripe. So in the first year, you'll get closed green cones, which the squirrels will still eat. And then in their second year, they'll become ripe and they'll turn this brown woody colour. And then in good weather, they'll open up and the seeds will fall out from underneath all of these scales. And they've got a little wing on them, so they'll either drop to the ground or blow away in the wind. So the squirrels want to get to these seeds before they all drop. And to do that, they peel off the scales one by one. So they kind of get them in their teeth and rip them off, sometimes leaving quite a mess. And you end up with discarded bits like this. So in the top left, you can see what the pine seeds look like, the pine nuts. They look quite different to the ones that we would buy from shops. They are a different species, basically a smaller version of the same ones that we eat. They're really nutritious, squirrels, but they do need to eat quite a lot of them. So they want to make sure they get all of the seeds they can out of the pine cone. So they'll always eat them in the same way. They'll always peel the scales off, starting at the bottom, the wider end of the cone, and then turn them round and round, ripping the scales off with their teeth until they've made it most of the way to the top. And they'll usually leave a few scales at the top of the cone. So you end up with this almost sort of apple core left over. And then you'll often find a scattering of scales around as well. So the photo on the bottom left there is a picture of one cone that's been stripped with a few scales left at the top, and then a scattering of scales all around as well. So that's really iconic. That's a classic sign that there are red squirrels around. Now, there are other things that will eat pine cones as well, and all of these things, in fact, but they generally leave quite different signs. So something like a woodpecker will wedge a cone into maybe a fork in some branches or into a gap in some tree bark, and will hammer away using its beak and basically sort of break the cone up into pieces, or you'll find these hammered away at bits in a cone. Sometimes you'll still find them wedged into the tree. So they're not ripping them from the bottom up to the top. They're just hammering away wherever they can reach the cone. Crossbills have specially adapted beaks to break into things like Scots pine. The top part of their beak crosses over the bottom, so they can sort of twist and split cones and scales apart with quite clean lines. So on the bottom right there, you can see an example of some crossbill feeding sign where the cones themselves have actually been split in quite clean lines. And then something else that can be a little bit confusing when you're first learning this stuff is just rotten cones. They've just started to rot away over time, and some of the scales have fallen off and become quite fibrous. And again, with this one in the top right, you can see that it hasn't been peeled from the bottom towards the top of the cone. So it's quite clearly not a squirreled cone. And then these are some examples of non-native feeding sign. So in the top right, we've got spruce, and again, it's been peeled like a Scots pine cone from the bottom towards the top, leaving some scales at the top. The bottom middle, we've got Douglas fir, and then on the left, we've got larch. And with larch cones, they leave this sort of rows of scales at the top of the cone. And then other animal sign, just to show you how different it can be. The hazel shell in the middle there has been eaten by a wood mouse. So they don't have mouths big enough or strong enough to break the shells clean in half. So they'll nibble a hole in the side of the shell and just basically poke their noses in and eat as much as they can like that. Woodpeckers, as I said, are just hammering away anywhere they can on the cone. Crossbills are splitting them. That's a larch cone in the bottom right, where you can see on some of the scales, there's a line down the middle where it's being split open. And then mice eat the cones in a way that looks kind of similar to red squirrels, except usually it's a lot neater, because rather than tearing the scales off, they are nibbling across and leaving sort of neater edges. So how can you help? Well, citizen science is really, really important, not just to Trees for Life, but as I mentioned earlier, to saving Scotland's red squirrels as well. So if you go on the website scottishsquirrels.org.uk, and anytime you've seen a red squirrel or a grey squirrel, you can put a pin in the map and you can log your sighting. And that helps build a picture over time of where squirrels are spreading to, red squirrels and grey squirrels, what the numbers are looking like. So it helps keep us and the Scottish Wildlife Trust and other organisations as well to keep track of how well the squirrels are doing. Now, obviously, if you're not in Scotland or not visiting Scotland, there are other ways to do this in other parts of the UK as well, and potentially in other parts of the world. There are probably recording programmes going on. So I will put all of these links in the chat at the end so that you can easily follow them and start recording your sightings. So that is the end of the presentation, but we've got plenty of time if anyone has any questions that they want to ask. And just to say that there is a lot more information on our website as well, so please do take a look there. You'll also find games and activities and educational resources and information about some of our projects, including at the moment, we have a crowdfunder going to help us with an appeal for beavers. So all of the information for that is on our website as well, if you'd like to take a look. So at this point, I'm going to ask Becky, have we got any questions so far?
Yeah, no questions on the chat so far, but if anyone has got any questions, please do let us know now.
Hopefully everybody's found the chat button.
Okay, so Florian is saying anything stopping grey squirrels from taking over in the long run, and as mentioned, possibly pine martens. So the main thing really that's stopping grey squirrels getting up into the Highlands at the moment is the work that's been done by the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels project, plus a couple of other projects up in northern England as well. And that's basically grey squirrel control. So basically monitoring both red and grey squirrel populations and then trapping and dispatching grey squirrels. So, that's sometimes controversial and something that not everyone likes. However, in terms of protecting red squirrels, it's critically important because that's basically what's stopping the greys spreading up into the Highlands. And in terms of pine martens, yeah, that's a very interesting one. So some of you may have heard about some work that was done a few years ago over in Northern Ireland by Dr. Emma Sheehy. And she was basically looking at the relationship between pine martens and red squirrels and grey squirrels. And she found that wherever pine marten populations were recovering, they were actually pushing out the greys, and that was then allowing reds to return. And they think the reasons for that is because grey squirrels aren't native to the UK. So first of all, possibly they're not used to pine martens as a predator. But also because they're heavier than red squirrels, they spend a lot more time foraging on the ground, and so are possibly easier for pine martens to catch, whereas red squirrels have evolved with pine martens. So there is some interest possibly over, the sort of expansion of pine martens. They also experienced massive declines in the past, but they've since undergone a good recovery. And they're now round about the Scottish border and starting to spread down into England. So, long term, that'll be a really interesting one to see whether they are able to start pushing back some of the grey squirrel populations. Okay, there's questions whizzing in now. I'll just see what the next.
Okay.
Why don't you do captive breeding to release? So there's a couple of reasons around that one, really. The main thing really is around disease. So at the moment, we only take squirrels from the Highlands, and that is an area that is free of squirrel pox. So it means that obviously it's still very important to do the health checks, but it means that there's really a very low risk that any of the squirrels that we catch would have squirrel pox. Whereas if we were to take them from a captive breeding institution, those may well be within the range of squirrel pox. So we'd have to do much more rigorous testing. We'd probably have to hold the squirrels overnight or possibly for a number of days to get them blood tested. And I think also any animal that's come from a captive breeding institution in a zoo environment, for example, will have been subject to a much wider range of pathogens. So it's basically just to minimize the risk of disease transmission, really. And also it's just easier. Kat mentioned that we do hard release, where we basically just let the squirrels go at the other end. Roy Dennis, who began squirrel translocations in the Highlands, he did trial doing soft release, which is where he built release pens at the release site and kept the squirrels in those cages for a few days. But he found that actually one or two squirrels died within the cages, probably due to the stress of being kept in a cage and with other squirrels in close proximity. So I think if we were taking squirrels from captive breeding institutions, we probably wouldn't just let them go. We'd have to keep them in cages, etc. And so, as I've said, there's reasons why we don't do that. What are the signs of squirrel pox, and what should you do if you spot one? So squirrel pox is a really nasty disease. It doesn't affect grey squirrels, but it will kill red squirrels within about 2 weeks of them contracting it. And they get these really nasty lesions, generally around their face and their genitals and their paws. So it's really obvious if a squirrel's got it. They'll be moving very slowly, they'll be very lethargic, and they'll just look very ill, and you'll see these lesions all over them. If you spot one, well, you let someone know immediately. Depends where you live. That if you live in Scotland, you could get in touch with Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels Project. If you're in Northern England, there's Red Squirrels Northern England. Kat will be able to put links to these in the chat at the end. Or alternatively, you can just call the SSPCA or the RSPCA, or even just your local vet. Just let some authority know, and someone will know who exactly to contact. Do you link with those running red squirrel sites in England, e.g. Formby Hawes? So no, we don't directly, no. We're part of the UK Squirrel Accord, which a lot of other organisations that are working in red squirrel conservation are also members of. But we don't actually have direct links with anyone doing red squirrel conservation in England. Just scroll down. Is there anything to prompt further optimism in planned environmental legislation from Westminster and/or Scottish governments? Not sure exactly what that question's referring to in terms of squirrels. Have you got any thoughts on that one, Kat?
Not off the top of my head, no.
I mean, so basically red squirrels are a protected species at the moment. So it's illegal to disturb a squirrel or its dray. That's the only sort of direct protection that red squirrels have at the moment. I suppose in terms of grey squirrel control, that would be the only sort of future direction. But as I said, that does go on by a number of organisations already. Pine martens and squirrels. What is the altitude limit for red squirrels? Oh God, that's going to get me. Perhaps it coincides with the distribution of suitable size. Yeah, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the altitude limit is. You certainly get them all across Europe, and in many of those regions, the forest extends much higher than it does in the UK. Anyway. To my mind, as far high, as far up as the dense sort of forest cover extends, you're likely to get squirrels. As soon as the forest cover starts petering out and the trees are getting smaller and a bit more sparse, that will be the point at which you wouldn't really find squirrels in it anymore.
Yeah, I've read that in the Alps and the Pyrenees, they can be found living as high as 2,000 meters above sea level.
Okay, there you go. Someone's looking to plant specific trees to help support reds. We were just going to plant hazel, but what would you recommend? Yeah, so hazel's a fantastic species. That's pretty much their favourite food. Depends where you're living. Oak is another good native one. Kat mentioned that beech isn't necessarily native to Scotland, but if you're down in England, that would be a good one. What's really good for squirrels really is just have a nice mix of things. So you actually get the highest densities of red squirrels in mixed woodland, and that's because if one species has a poor seed year, it means they've got other food sources to rely on. So just any sort of mix of things is really nice. Hazel's definitely good. If you can plant some Scots pine, that's fantastic. And even, some non-native things like larch are good as well. But they'll also eat just, like catkins from birch and even alder and that. So just a nice mix of things is a really good idea. Do you use any habitat management techniques to make habitats attractive to red squirrels and unattractive to grey squirrels? So that's an interesting one. So prior to us beginning our project, most of the management for red squirrels that was going on in the Highlands was to try to make forests unattractive to grey squirrels to prevent the spread up north. And so the sort of historic policy has been to not include large broadleaf seed trees in highland forests, and indeed in other areas where there are still red squirrels. So I think, you know, organisations like the Forestry Commission, etc., won't plant big broadleaf trees like oak in areas where there are red squirrels, and that's for all the reasons that Kat was talking about, because grey squirrels are able to utilise those food sources earlier in the season than reds are. So, however, in areas where there are no grey squirrels, it's absolutely fine to include those species, and actually will give better densities of red squirrels in those areas. So that's what's been done traditionally. So, sorry, I'm just looking at this. Do you need any? So there's nothing really more that you can do on top of that. But as I'm saying, in areas where you've got the grey squirrels, it's best not to plant the large broadleaf seed trees. Really, altitude, I mean to say trees of suitable size. So in terms of tree size, trees need to be of an age that's producing a reasonable seed crop. So from around about 10 years of age, those trees are producing a reasonable seed crop that squirrels will start to utilise. Do you use what3words.com for exact locations tracking? I've never heard of that, actually. No, Kat, have you heard of that at all?
I have heard of that. I've heard of that being used by hikers, for instance, when they're out in the mountains or something. It's kind of a safety thing that they can use to, if they need to call for help, someone can locate them. I've not heard of that being used in conservation at all, actually. I guess generally because people have got spot trackers or GPS devices, and that will probably do the same job.
Okay. Do you work with any of Anders Poulsen's rewilding projects? So not directly, no. So Anders is a local landowner here in the Highlands. He's got a very big rewilding project going on locally. We don't directly work with him, but yeah, some of the work he's doing is absolutely fantastic. What are the differences between reds and grey strays? To the normal eye, very little. As you've seen in some of the pictures, they're very high up in the trees and not always that easy to distinguish. I would imagine grey strays may be slightly bigger. I don't know if you've read anything about that, Kat.
Not read anything specifically, but that's what I would expect as well, because I mean, grey squirrels can be almost twice the size, certainly twice the weight. So you'd imagine that they would be bigger, and they can also have bigger litters, can't they?
Yeah. And also just touching on that in terms of feeding sign, there's no real difference in terms of feeding sign as well. A strip cone or hazel or oak will look exactly the same depending on whether it's been eaten by a red or a grey. Do you know if the red squirrels that were introduced from Sweden were genetically close to the native population? I'm not sure on that, to be honest, from the original reintroductions. It's thought now that the generally within the Scottish population, the genetics are probably pretty limited. And that's because they came from reintroductions from a relatively limited number of sources. But in terms of what the original genetics were compared to the Scandinavian populations, I'm not entirely sure. And I think that's it. Are there any other questions just before we finish?
I've got a question I would like to ask everybody, actually, if all of their questions have stopped coming in. Oh, I can see more coming in now. I can see something flashing.
Just a thank you.
Okay. So a question that I want to ask the people who are still here is, if you've enjoyed this webinar and you would like to see more, what kind of topics would you like us to cover? So maybe about our different projects or Caledonian pinewood species. What sort of things would you like to know about? If you could just put an answer in the chat, then we will try and factor it into our plans for 2021. I'm going to stop sharing now so I can
see these answers. Okay, some good ideas in here. Thank you.
So much interest on such a diverse range of subjects.
It is, it's brilliant. Thank you so much for all these ideas, everyone. Lots of good topics for next year. Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's great to see such a good turnout and to see people from all over the place being interested in the work that we do. As I say, we couldn't do the work we do without the supporters that we have. So thank you.